lighting, different time, different angle, but still, we're talking about Buffy. So let's look at the top 10 episodes. Number 10, The Wish. After Cordelia wishes that Buffy had never come to Sunnydale, that is granted by Anyanka, Vengeance Demon, and Cordelia is thrust into an alternate reality where Buffy never came to Sunnydale. When you look at this episode, you could easily make the argument that it in no way furthers the plot. The one character to actually go through growth, Cordelia, ends up dying and doesn't remember a thing that she learned. There are, however, two things that it does that help further the plot. The first is introduce Anyanka, who of course would later become the love interest to Xander, which is amusing when you consider her first appearance was basically cursing Xander. The second thing it does is introduce Vamp Willow, who aside from being immensely creepy, comes back later in the season to help further Willow's character. But what I like about this particular episode is not the plot furtherance, but the alternate reality itself. See, alternate universes just fascinate me, and this is a darker version of what's already a pretty dark place. The Master has risen, having nobody stop him from doing so, and as a result, Sunnydale is a much darker place. Xander and Willow are both vampires. Giles and Oz are a part of a group that fights vampires. Angel is a plaything for Willow. Seriously, she is creepy. Buffy is by far the most drastically changed. I don't necessarily count Willow and Xander in that because they're turned into vampires. Again, Willow, creepy. Buffy has changed not because she's a vampire, but because she grew up in a very different environment. Without the Scooby, she becomes a much more hardened Slayer. She becomes more like Kendra, relying purely on cool logic and not at all on emotion. The difference between the two is that Kendra learns to use her emotion more because she meets Buffy, but Buffy didn't have that, so she's completely closed off from other people. To her, slaying is just a job. Nothing more, nothing less. And unlike her real-world counterpart, she doesn't work well with others. The entire last scene is done really well. The music, the narration by Anya, the slow-motion fighting, Buffy killing Xander, Oz killing Willow, the final neck break of Buffy. This entire episode is an interesting what-if story, telling us what would happen if Buffy had never come to Sunnydale. And clearly, if she had never come to Sunnydale, the world would have gone to hell. Number 9. The Weight of the World. After Dawn gets kidnapped by Glory, Buffy goes into a catatonic state, and Willow must dive into her subconscious to see if she can get her out. Glory prepares Dawn for the opening, the whole subconscious thing. Ben and Glory start drifting apart. Ben shows his true colors. Spike looks for Glory. Spike and Xander get information from Doc. But the most important thing about this particular episode is that journey into the subconscious. So in this entire episode, we see the cycle that her mind is going through. So we see when Dawn was first delivered, the moment when Buffy gave up, the message from the first Slayer, and her eventual killing of Dawn. Because it's the cycle of what she feels. When Dawn was delivered, she asked if she could take care of her, and now she feels that she has killed Dawn. And it's interesting because I see a correlation between Buffy's fight with herself and Ben's fight with Glory. Here we have two people fighting very powerful individuals, with Buffy fighting herself, and with Ben fighting against Glory. Buffy has given up, and she feels that she's killed her sister. And while it takes Willow coming in and yelling at her, she does eventually find the strength to continue. Ben and Glory, as I mentioned, have been drifting apart more so than they were before. Near the end of the episode, there's this fight between Ben and Glory, which, aside from being pretty impressive to watch, is also a very good indication of how not strong Ben is. And whereas Buffy has given up at the beginning of her cycle, Ben actually begins with the strength to go against Glory and to fight with her. But the difference here is that he ends up losing his strength because Glory gives him the opportunity to not die in the end. And he takes her offer and actually gives Dawn to the minions. So he started with the strength, but then lost it and gave up to Glory. So we have this correlation, Buffy starting with giving up, but getting the strength to continue, and Ben having the strength to continue, but then giving up. And of course, in the end, it's Buffy who comes out on top. Number 8. Normal again. After being stabbed in the arm by a demon sent by Andrew, Buffy begins having hallucinations where she is in a mental ward and Sunnydale is nothing more but a place she made up. One of the interesting and somewhat frightening things about this episode is that they make the whole mental ward thing very plausible. They explain everything. They explain that this is nothing but a world she made up. That Dawn was made up because she wanted some sister relationships, that she fought these big demons as big bads, and now it's just 3 nerds that she knew in high school. And it's little things like that that make it possible that Sunnydale may just be an imaginary place that Buffy made up. And in this particular universe, her parents are still together, and, her mother's not dead. As Buffy continues to go back to this world, switching between Sunnydale and this world, she finds herself more drawn to this world and tries to get rid of Sunnydale entirely. In many ways, this episode deals with the same one that the previous episode did. She's given up. She wants to give up and just lead a normal life. She just goes a little crazier this time than she did last time. And really, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense, considering what she's been through. Her parents are separated, her mother is dead, the other parental figure she had in her life, Giles, has just left. She's been brought back from the dead, where she was very happy, and now she has the trio completely messing with her. She's dealing with quite a lot, and it makes perfect sense that she would want to escape that life and live a normal one. And in the end, it's words from the hallucination Joyce that gives Buffy the strength to continue in the Sunnydale life. And while Joyce was trying to tell Buffy she has the strength to fight the Sunnydale life, she inadvertently allows the Buffy in this life to essentially die. Again, making it seem very possible that this mental ward was the actual real life, which was just unsettling. Number 7. Grave. Everything that happens in Season 6 comes to fruition in this episode. Dark Willow tries to kill Jonathan and Andrew, and because this is Buffy and it's how all seasons need to end, tries to destroy the world while Buffy and the gang try to stop her. Now, this is the episode on the list that contains Dark Willow, not counting Storyteller. And let's be honest, there's no point denying the fact that Dark Willow is a pretty badass villain. I mean, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want her to stick around because I like Good Willow too much, but still, pretty kick-ass villain. It's also a villain that you don't quite know what to do with. And the reason for this is because her power is drawn from grief over Tara's death. So it starts out being very sympathetic because, her lover just died. But then she goes all evil, but you don't want to kill her because it's still Willow, so what do? See, in the previous seasons, the previous 5 seasons, it was a simple matter of killing the big bad. Well, okay, yeah, it was rarely simple, but you get the idea. So they needed to come up with some way to stop Willow without killing her. And that's where Xander comes in. And it makes perfect sense to have Xander be the one who saves the day. See, throughout the entire season, Xander was feeling useless. And yes, he's dealt with this before the Zeppo, but in this case, it's very different. Because not only is he feeling useless, he's feeling like everything is his fault. I mean, he left Anya at the altar, and then he feels like he could have stopped Warren from killing Tara, which is what did the whole Willow turning evil thing. And whether he would have actually been able to or not is not really the point. The point is he feels like he could have, so he blames himself. So it makes perfect sense that Xander would be the one to save the world. And the ending scene between Willow and Xander is probably one of the most emotional scenes in this entire show. And before I move on to the next episode, I do want to address one thing, and that's the circular nature of what Buffy's been through. See, at the very beginning of this entire season, she of course crawls her way out of her grave. And in the end of the season, she crawls her way out of her grave. I mean, okay, it's not her grave, but it's still a grave. But they're both very different. At the beginning of the season, she crawls out of her grave alone, and during the nighttime, and so she's very confused and very alone. And at the end, she crawls out with Dawn during the daytime, which in many ways represents the hope that she finally has, and the hope that she can finally live. Number 6. Fool for Love. After being stabbed by her own stake, Buffy asks Spike about the 2 Slayers that he killed. To understand what makes this episode good, we have to look into the character of Spike. Spike first appeared as the big bad of Season 2, and he came off as basically a ruthless killer who was never afraid to just step into the fight, and you really couldn't call him a sympathetic character. This episode did what no episode before it did, and that was make Spike a sympathetic character. Like at the end, when Buffy threw the money at Spike and used the exact same words that Cecily used to reject him and he started crying. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, you may remember me mentioning this episode in Lies My Parents Told Me, and as I said there, this episode delves much more into Spike's backstory. We start with seeing him as he was as a human, which is a very caring and slightly bookish individual. So it's interesting to see that, and then, of course, him becoming a vampire. And we see the 2 Slayers he killed, the one he killed during the Boxer Rebellion, and the one he killed in 1977. And these explanations lead to one of probably the most well-shot scenes in the entire series. In this scene, Spike is fighting Nikki, who's the Slayer that he killed in 1977. But he's also explaining the fight to Buffy, so it constantly switches between the 1977 fight between Nikki and Spike and the present-day fight between Buffy and Spike. And there are even moments when the 1977 Spike speaks directly to the present-day Buffy. What this episode did ultimately was round out his character much more and helped him become the character that he is for the final 2 seasons. A few more things to mention about this episode before I move on. 1, this episode shows that Spike does care for Buffy. When he comes in at the end, he's all intent on killing her, and nothing stops him, except when he can tell that Buffy is very upset about something. And instead of killing her, he sits down next to her and tries to comfort her. 2, I love watching Spike and Angelus together. The reason these 2 work so well is because they're basically complete opposites. 1 is very emotional. He is perfectly willing to jump into the fray and not give it much thought. The other is much more logical. He treats killing more like an art. And as I mentioned in my whole Spike versus Angel video, these 2 just work so well together. 3, and finally, the whole idea of Slayers having a death wish basically becomes the point of the entire rest of the season, and even beyond. And this whole idea eventually culminated, if that's the word I'm looking for, in Buffy sacrificing her life to save the world. Number 5. The body. After finding her mother dead, Buffy, along with the rest of the Scoobies, has to deal with her death. First of all, I'm just gonna come right out and say it. This is not an easy episode to watch. I mean, it deals with death, so that probably goes without saying. This is on the list, not necessarily because I like watching it, but because it's very well done. What this episode does is that it lets us see how all these characters deal with the death of a loved one, and in many ways it reflects on their own character. Buffy goes numb, which is a problem that continues for this season and the next, though, to be fair, her being numb in the next season is due to something completely different. Dawn is in disbelief, a disbelief that continues into the next episode. Xander gets angry. Willow gets more flustered. Anya's is probably the most depressing, completely breaking down because nobody will explain exactly what death means, and she just doesn't understand it. Tara remains calm because she's been through this before. And the way that she can sit down and talk to Buffy about what she's going through just gives me another reason to love her. Giles remains calm too, but since he's basically the adult of the group, it makes a certain amount of sense. What really separates this episode from the rest is the complete lack of music. In many ways, this episode is the complete opposite of Hush, which will be talked about later. In Hush, the episode depends purely on the music and the action. There's very little dialogue. In this episode, it relies fully on dialogue. There's no music and only one action scene at the very end. Since Joss is very good at writing dialogue, it makes sense that this would be a good episode. Ultimately, this is not an episode that I really enjoy watching because it is immensely depressing, but it more than deserves to be on this list. Number 4. Restless. After defeating Adam, the gang falls asleep and they all have dreams where they meet the first Slayer, who then tries to kill them. This entire episode is very well done, and Basically everything in it is either symbolic or prophetic. It's hard to pick one aspect of this episode to talk about, so I'm just going to briefly talk about each dream and why it's good. Now, before I do that, I do want to say that I'm only going to be picking out a few things from each dream. There is a lot going on in this episode, and I could probably devote an entire video just talking about it, so I'm only going to touch on a few of the basics. The first dream is Willow's. Willow is very afraid that people only like her for what she's become, so in her dream she ends up going back to the way she was before, and, of course, everyone ridicules her for it. Another thing is that most of her dream takes place on the stage, because of her stage fright, so it makes sense. And at the end of her dream, she gets killed by having her life sucked out of her, because she is the spirit of the group. The next dream is Xander's. The first thing about this dream is that it's the longest, which makes perfect sense because Xander does have a tendency to miss the point. It does tend to take him longer to figure things out than it does the rest of the group. There are a few other things, including Xander constantly ending up back in his parents' basement, which is the worry that he's not going anywhere, Xander being unable to understand Giles and Anya, feeling that he's helpless, Buffy calling him Big Brother, which is pretty self-explanatory. And, in the end, he gets killed by having his heart ripped out, because he is the heart of the group. The next dream is Giles. Ziz. His dream is the shortest, which, again, makes sense, because he would be the one to figure it out the soonest. It starts with Giles being the father of Buffy, basically reflecting the father-like figure he plays in Buffy's life. We also get Giles singing, which is fun, and likely only that way because Anthony Stewart had sung in an earlier episode and the fans wanted him to sing more because he has a wonderful voice, but the song itself isn't completely pointless. First of all, it makes sense that he would sing because this is his dream, and he sings when people aren't watching, usually, because he doesn't like people knowing about that aspect of his life, so it makes sense that in his dream, he would be able to sing openly. And also, during the song, he figures out who's in the dream, who's hunting all these people, right before he gets his brain ripped out, because he is the brains of the group. The final dream is Buffy's. And obviously there's a variety of things, including Tara saying be back before dawn, as in Buffy's sister, Adam and Buffy's exchange about them not being very different, Riley calling her killer, and of course the conversation between Buffy and the first Slayer is a very important part of the next season, dealing with the whole, this particular Slayer having friends, despite the fact that the Slayer should act alone. And in the end, Buffy has the strength to defeat the first Slayer, because in the group, she is the strength. And then of course there's the Cheese Man. Wonder what that's all about. Number 3. Hush. When the fairy tale of the gentleman come to life, Buffy and the gang must find a way to stop them before they collect their 7 hearts. Also, it's a silent episode. The story behind how this episode came into being is amusing in its own way. Apparently, Joss kept hearing people say that Buffy is good solely on its dialogue. And then the next thing you know, the silent episode comes out. So basically it's just one big challenge accepted. Now this episode isn't purely silent, but the main action takes place in a silent world. And the silent world aspect is what really separates this episode from the others, because there's no dialogue, and it relies fully on music and action. This showcased both how good these actors are, because it is not easy to act without sound, and also it showed that Joss can write a good episode without dialogue. It also shows just how important words are to our society. This isn't necessarily something we think about all that much, but in this episode, when we see that words have been removed, it's chaos. People freak out, there are fights, there's destruction. It's not necessarily something you think about, but words are very important to us as a society. Now, there isn't too much to say about this episode, but I do want to mention 2 more things. First, the gentleman, who's probably some of the creepiest villains that these people have come out with, and that's saying an awful lot. Second, this is Tara's first episode, so it has that going for it. Number 2, Chosen. Buffy, the gang, and the Potentials all prepare for the final battle against the First. This is the season finale to end all season finales. Now, a lot happens in this episode, which makes sense since it's the final episode of the final season. All the little things explored in this season, and even some of the earlier ones, come to fruition and come full circle in this episode. The Potentials, both the ones collected by Buffy and the gang, and anyone else, become Slayers. Willow's power is purely good, not evil. Anya sacrifices herself not just for a human, but for a man. Faith has a meaningful relationship with the guy, or at least it's implied. Spike sacrifices himself to save Sunnydale and finally feels his soul, among other things. The final battle is just amazing. It's shot well, it's amazingly epic, and Felicia Day is wonderfully badass. Ultimately, I love how this episode ends because I love how the series ends. Throughout the entire series, from season 1 to the very end, all Buffy has really wanted to do is lead a normal life. She's accepted the fact that she is the Slayer, but she would like to lead a life without that looming over her head. And in the end, she doesn't have it looming over her head anymore. She's free to do what she wants, because she's not the only Slayer. Now, does that mean the problems are just going to go away? No, of course not. But in the end, she's free to do whatever she wants. And the #1 episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer is Once More with Feeling. Well, yeah. I mean, you probably saw this one coming. If you know anything about me and anything about Buffy, you probably could have guessed that my favorite episode is the musical one. I suppose I should still give a brief description of the plot. A musical demon named Sweet comes down to Sunnydale and causes everyone to sing and dance. And the bulk of the episode is basically the gang trying to figure it out and then trying to save Dawn from Sweet, who's kidnapped her. So, why is this #1? Well, it's a musical, first of all, and it's a good one, which makes sense because Joss Whedon, but it's more than that. This episode is enjoyable, whether you've watched the entire series or haven't. I mean, okay, you won't understand a thing that's going on if you haven't seen the rest of the series, but you'll still enjoy yourself. And when you look at it in the context of the entire season, it's just brilliant. Now, each song individually is wonderful, and I will talk about that in my new series, maybe soon. And it's explained why it's a musical. Joss just didn't make it a musical. He explained, and his explanation was sweet. That is sweet, not sweet. And, incidentally, Sweet is easily my favorite minor villain. And the musical aspect of this episode is very well done, showing a few little things in the background, like the slow dancing individuals and the dancing janitors, and showing a few things in the foreground, like the lady singing about a parking ticket. But the thing about this episode is that it's the ultimate proof that Joss Whedon is a mad genius. Because he's a genius, but he's crazy. And here's why. This episode could not have been done in any other way. I'm going to repeat that. This episode could not have been done in any other way. Remember back when I talked about Shrek the Musical, and I talked about why musicals are good because they allow us to look into the character's psyche because they're singing about it? Well, that's why this episode had to be done in this way. You see, the characters of Buffy have a lot of pent-up emotion that they don't let out. Spike feels used by Buffy, Giles feels like he's holding Buffy back, Anya and Xander have doubts about their marriage-to-be, Dawn's feeling neglected, Buffy's come back from heaven and isn't happy about it. And these are all things that would stay inside if they weren't forced to let them out. Like if they sang about it. This season could not have progressed without this, or at least it couldn't have done it as quickly as it did, and it's just amazing. Joss, I don't know how you do it, but I bow down to you. I bow down to you and your greatness. And that is why this is my all-time favorite episode. And that's my list, the top 20 Buffy episodes. Do you agree or disagree? What's your favorite episode? Let me know down in the comments. And remember, first of all, that the 5 runners-up still down in the doobly-doo if you want to check that out. And also remember, life's a song. And I think that's something to sing about.
She'll get pissed if I missed to see my sister.